Let's go into three very different new releases we had this past weekend. One of which was all theaters, one was theaters and HBO Max, and one was Netflix. So let's go ahead and start with Venom, I think. Let There Be Carnage, which was built up, obviously, in the first movie. And it was a case where that end credit scene came around and it was like, hey, Woody Harrelson's going to be Carnage, and it's like, oh, that's very interesting, and I have a morbid curiosity to see what that would be like. But at the time, in October of 2018, the day I saw Venom, the day it came out. So at that time, it was still a case of, is this gonna make enough money for a sequel? I don't know. It didn't sound like people were that excited for this, but it turned out people were excited for it because it made like $850 million or something. So we did get our sequel with Woody Harrelson playing Carnage. And what's interesting about this is these movies, these two Venom movies, regardless of them being, I think we can all say, like, even the people that get enjoyment out of them, I think we can all agree that like in an almost objective sense, there's something not incredibly great about them, whether it be writing or filmmaking or whatever. But there's something so unique about them and their placement in movies as they are now, with superhero movies being where they're at, where it's like you have these really big blockbuster superhero movies, specifically the MCU movies, that are just the biggest thing ever, making all the money and doing all these big things. And then you have this not quite MCU property just sort of hanging out here like a bastard child, but because of that, it's almost like it gives it the freedom to do whatever it wants, and that's kind of amazing, and and extremely entertaining to see what all exactly they're going to do. Because I remember when the first one came out, a lot of people were saying that, it didn't look that great, and it looked like it was in the wrong era, like it looked like it was in like the early 2000s or something. And the way they embraced comedy in the first movie seemed to kind of take people by surprise, and they weren't exactly expecting that, particularly the relationship between Venom and Eddie. And then the way the sequel decides to basically just completely, I don't even know if you can call it doubling down, maybe quadrupling down on the comedic factor and the light factor, and just having PG-13 fun with itself. And there's some like technical things in there where I even wonder if it's just part of the absurdity, because we did have, I think it was Ruben Fleischer did the first movie, and now we have Andy Serkis doing this one, who has shown that he's not exactly the strongest director. Before, he did like a boring biopic with Andrew Garfield, and then he did that Jungle Book movie after Favreau's, that wasn't as good. But obviously he's got a grasp on the motion capture and stuff like that. But as far as some of the other technical aspects, we have this scene here at the beginning where we see Cleus Cassidy and Shriek as younger people in this home. And I could have been mistaken, but when Cassidy was talking, I am almost positive Woody Harrelson was dubbing him, which is... So it's like, okay, I can't tell if this is part of the absurdity or not, but let's go ahead and run with it, because we already kind of know the tone the movie's going to be going for anyway. So there's going to be a whole lot of stuff that you would just completely rip apart a movie for in any other circumstance. But because of the tone this movie has embraced, it's almost like it's up to you to make the decision of whether this is appropriate for this movie or not, because it may very well be, and almost kind of enhance that experience, I guess. But as far as embracing the comedy, yeah, we do have stuff. Just like something you'd see in any other comedy, when he goes into a bathroom stall and he and Venom are yelling at each other, and of course there's going to be somebody else in the other stall just hearing this. It just feels like an absolute straight comedy that just happens to have, chaos and literally carnage surrounding it. And I guess it's the case of, should it have been the opposite? Should it have been the chaos and the carnage with the comedy sort of around it? But it feels like it's reverse from that, which could be part of its downfall as far as being like genuine quality rather than just this sort of guilty pleasure thing. Um, Especially with the way the comedy's handled with Venom himself, because Venom is basically providing commentary throughout this, which is a funny concept in itself. And you could say he's, providing commentary from, like, Eddie's psyche, and, like, sort of, it's him judging himself in some ways. But it's also a case of, while Venom can be very funny when he's doing this, he also seems to embody, and maybe this is on purpose too, I don't know. Venom seems to embody that one annoying audience member that won't stop commentating on things that you just want to shut up. It kind of felt like that also, where like they'll make like funny comments thinking they're gonna win the room over. It felt like Venom was that a little bit as well as a character, but the thing that makes this so great though is Hardy's commitment to it, and I think that's what's winning so many people over as far as audiences go. Is just Hardy's full, because I've obviously praised Hardy as much as I possibly can for many different projects, and this one especially, like this is a case where I really don't see these movies being the success that they are with another actor. Like I don't think anybody would commit as hard to this role as Hardy clearly has, and especially the fact that there's so much of it where he's playing off nobody. Like when he and Venom are just sort of talking. And there's obviously times where Venom is here physically, but then there's other times where it's just Eddie walking around, talking to him in his head, and I said that where he could basically, you could like cut this movie down enough to where you could get a one-man show out of it, which is pretty amazing also, and so I can see how that can be totally irresistible to an audience. And there are moments of creativity here though that do kind of rise above a little bit of it just being like, oh, it's just entertaining because of how whatever insane thing they're going to do next, or whatever thing they're going to come up with, or whatever comedic beat is going to happen next. There's a very interesting, well, it's not so much the backstory of Cassidy and Shriek is interesting, but the way that it's shown through like animation and like drawings is done in this really interesting way, and it kind of rises above just being that usual boring exposition. So adding some sort of visual flair to exposition is always going to be a plus and help a lot. And there's obviously going to eventually be a lot going on as far as, like, action and things being torn apart. It takes a little bit. There's a lot, for the kind of movie that it is, there's quite a bit focus on the characters themselves. We do bring Michelle Williams back, and then we have the whole Dan thing that she has going on, and they're not particularly interesting, and Williams is kind of wasted again. But they do focus on the characters for a while, but then once Carnage comes into it, then things start to go like, holy shit, crazy. And obviously one of the big problems with the first movie was how dark it looked, and how, when he was fighting Riz Ahmed, everything looked really just black all over the place, and their appearances, when he was Riot, I think was Riz Ahmed's name, they just kind of look like the same thing, just kind of one blob going back and forth, and that was a problem. So this one is, more well lit. Like, you can tell more of what's going on. And I kind of had my mind blown when I was, because I knew a mid-credit scene was coming, so I was just sitting there watching the end credits. And I think I audibly made a noise when a credit came up, because I had no idea that Robert Richardson was the cinematographer on this. And if you're unaware, Robert Richardson has done, like, Tarantino's last few movies. He did a lot of Oliver Stone's movies. Most notably, probably, he's done a lot of Scorsese movies. And you can see where, like, number one, just in general, Robert Richardson doing a movie like this is interesting in itself. But then thinking about Scorsese's comments that were a bit blown out of proportion, but still, the thought of Scorsese's cinematographer doing a Venom sequel is so, it's amazing. But I was very, very surprised to learn that. And it's not like, and I would probably have been disappointed if I knew going in, because while just the fact itself is amazing enough, if I had known Richardson shot this, I probably would have expected a bit more. Like, it would have been interesting to imagine what this would look like if it was, like, very, very, very competently, shot in the composition and all that. But You know, it still looks like a Venom movie, but I just found that very very interesting. I do think they did. There's some nice beats in the score, particularly the Carnage stuff. Like obviously when a lot of the action's happening, it's just that generic score. But they did almost have like this sort of sinister vibe going on in some cases also. So I was really liking that also. And then yeah, once the action kicks in, like there's one big centerpiece scene, Carnage just completely wreaking havoc. That's kind of great, and it makes you glad that you could see something like that in like a theater again is nice as well. Even if it is just noise and explosions and stuff like that, there's still like it's still extremely entertaining. Like it's that may seem like the bar is low and all that, and or my expectations are low or whatever, but that's I don't know what else you would go to a Venom movie for. Like I get if they're changing things up. Like you got Robert Richardson shooting it, you got Andy Serkis directing it, you got somebody as committed as Hardy. You would think maybe like there would be something a little more here than what there is quality wise. But I mean, if this is what you're here for, this is absolutely going to be what that is. Like I said, it's very easy to see how these have become successful. And I think especially that whole thing we were talking about, where it feels different in that sense of, while like the MCU movies feel like they're in this very careful bubble that Feige has very meticulously put together. Like the character himself, the Venom movies are just running completely wild. And I do get that some people are upset that they're stuck in PG-13 territory. But I don't know. There's still something like interestingly enough, you would think it would be the opposite, but I kind of feel like the fact that it's goreless almost adds even more to the camp. Like it adds even more to the ridiculousness. That it's like this whole like cartoon aspect where it just people are clearly dead, but we're not really seeing anything explicit happen to them. It's just kind of so absurd in itself. Like people are clearly getting their heads bitten off, but we just have to use like context clues to figure that out. And it's yeah, and it's wild. So, as far as like other characters go and their interactions, the whole Cassidy and Shriek thing is just kind of like I feel like there's something interesting as far as like the irony of Venom and Carnage. They're like one of their main weaknesses is sound, and Cassidy falls in love with Shriek of all people. They don't really do much of anything with that. There's like one moment where that comes into play briefly, and then that's about it. There's and they will and if you in case you forgot that one of Venom's weaknesses is sound, they will remind you of Venom's weaknesses over and over and over and over again in the dialogue. Dan in particular just has some really fucking dumb lines. Like it's like that's the thing about these movies is the writing is fucking terrible. But that's one of those cases where depending on where your expectations are, is that really going to matter? I do think it's worth noting how bad the dialogue is. Like you want to have fun with the movie and embrace it. But sometimes things, even when you're in that territory, things are noticeably bad. And the dialogue here is, yeah. Um, and I do think also we eventually get to a point where Venom goes to a rave, and talking about embracing the comedy and stuff like that. There are cases where I think there's a little. I feel like there's a line in regards to how much you embrace comedy, and it's like I wasn't sure because I've been through this with some other movies where they started off as another genre, but then they try to bring comedy into it, and a lot of the times that doesn't really work, especially if you're trying to go full into it. And here is where I kind of thought they were laying the comedy on a little thick. It was becoming really ridiculous in regards to it basically almost abandoning the action genre entirely just to be a comedy. And that's where I think, like, finding the balance is probably where the magic in that is. The balance of the absurdity, but with, whatever else is going on. And the fact that, we're dealing with characters that look terrifying with Venom and Carnage. But that's hardly a thing much now, because we've just completely embraced them as comedic characters. It gets a little weird. And it is worth noting, though, and I remember this actually making headlines when it was announced because it was so unexpected. This movie is incredibly short. It is an hour and a half. And that's, for a movie like this, that is incredibly short, especially if you're dealing with a lot of credits. So the fact that it is really short and the stakes like don't really go beyond what you're expecting. Like it's literally just, Venom versus Carnage, and that's pretty much it. And for the way movies like to overcomplicate themselves and like try to open up their worlds in ways that are overkill, it's nice to just see that's all it is we just have an antagonist, and that's pretty much all that's going on here. So that's refreshing. They do actually have bits where I was getting concerned because it seemed like we were going down the path of almost like they were trying to make Cassidy a sympathetic character in a way. And I really didn't like the direction that was headed, and I was really dreading like where that was going to end up. But it's they handled that in a satisfying way in the long run. So I'll just leave that at that. I was very satisfied with what that was leading to. So I think is that pretty much what's going on here. Obviously, there's I don't want to say too much about what's going on in the credits, but I'm interested. I can't. I'm interested if that's just like a one-off thing. That scene itself, like it's just an oh this is happening briefly thing, or if it's like we're headed somewhere. But if we are headed somewhere, that will be very interesting. That's all I can really say, I think. So most people watching this probably know what it is anyway, but just in case, I won't say. And there's some nice bits in here. I don't know how many people saw the Stan Lee magazine in the store, which is nice. Still being able to stick him in there post-death is really nice. So, yeah, so this was a whole lot of words to just basically say this movie is probably exactly what you think it is. And if that's better or worse for you, then that's what it is. So it's like I said, a part of me does wish there was a bit more, quality to take away from it. If there was more things in it that were genuinely good outside of Hardy's commitment, which is obviously can be commended in any regard, in any, yeah. So that's what that is. So let's go on to The Many Saints of Newark, which is the Sopranos prequel movie, and I will say right away, there are people that know the series, The Sopranos, basically like the back of their hand, because obviously it's been around it started over 20 years ago, and people have watched it over and over and over again and know like all the lines and all the characters, the major characters and the side characters, sometimes even just like, brief characters. I've seen the show 1.5 times. So there's probably still some things that were going past me that I didn't remember. And what's interesting about that is that I had heard dueling things going into this, because I know John Bernthal said something before it came out that almost kind of felt like Damage Control, where he was talking about how fans of the series would probably be really upset if they were expecting like something that felt exactly like the show and had a bunch of callbacks and stuff like that, and references and all that stuff, and seeing stuff that was referenced in dialogue before actually getting to see it play out, and that it wasn't going to be that. But then when people actually started seeing it and early words started coming out, I was hearing that it did have a lot of that, and and a lot of people were saying that that was a problem, was that there was too much of it. So I didn't know if this was going to be how much of this was going to go past me, but and I guess I still wouldn't know if it did. But I felt like I got enough. Like I didn't feel like I was in the dark or anything. So there's that. If you are watching this for some reason and haven't seen the show, there is a big spoiler in the opening scene, which we are going to mention right now, which is Christopher is narrating from the grave, which actually I think is a really cool way to start this and a cool way to tell this story. I know a lot of people were kind of upset. Alessandro Nivola is playing Dickie, which is really good casting, and he's definitely got something with this part. I know a lot of people thought it would have been cool if Michael Imperioli played him, especially since we've got Leota in here playing twins. That wouldn't have been that wouldn't have been weird in any way. As is, I do think it's interesting that they were able to put Christopher in this movie, and the whole thing where it's kind of coming full circle, where it is about his father, but it's also his connection to Tony and stuff like that, and how Tony is how he ended up in this grave. But as we go on, there is I noticed there was a lot going on about like what story was this telling? Was it a strictly Dickie story with a little bit of Tony, or was it watching Tony rise to power? And there was a lot of questioning about that, and if they were maybe using the Tony involvement just to kind of sell it a little more. I do think it's one of those cases where when you look at it, there's that thing where you idolize it because we know Tony idolized Dickie, so that's Tony's story in itself. But if we're looking at it from Dickie's perspective, and this is Dickie's story, there's often cases where when we idolize somebody, we're not a big part of that person's particular story. So it's almost like the movie is like an embodiment of that sentiment, I guess. So once again, much like we were talking about with Venom, interestingly enough, I guess it depends on what movie you're wanting or expecting is going to sway your opinion quite a bit on how you feel about this. So we do have a lot of the returning characters, some characters that we only sometimes saw or heard about that are here. Mainly Tony's parents, who are now being played by Vera Farmiga and John Bernthal. And what's really great about the casting of Bernthal as Giovanni is the fact that I feel like Bernthal has some very similar qualities to Gandolfini as far as the kind of actor that he is, where he's basically known for being the dude, like, just either looking at him or judging by parts he's played before, he's the dude that could easily beat your ass, and he's the guy that you kind of fear a little bit because you know what he's capable of or what he could be capable of, and that he's potentially dangerous. But then there's other performances you might see, or other even, bits from these characters that are initially threatening, where he's got like a certain sensitivity he can really find. And the fact that Bernthal's able to always capture that throughout his career felt very sort of Gandolfini-like, so it felt very appropriate casting there. The only trouble is that he's very underused. Like, once again, it's the whole thing where a lot of the concerns people might have going into this in regards to other characters can simply be answered with it's a Dickie story. I guess. But they open up a lot of things here, is the problem with that. To where you could push these concerns aside and say, well, it's Dickie's story, but even if the intent was for it to be Dickie's story, there's still a lot going on. They open up a lot of doors, all of which can't be fully explored in 2 hours. So there's that. And looking at Vera Farmiga, it is... Obviously, she's very good, and she really finds the essence of Olivia throughout it. Normally I don't get too caught up in this kind of thing, but I do have to say that I found the nose a little bit distracting. I don't know if I'm just too familiar with what Vera Farmiga looks like, but that's I kind of just kept drawing my attention to that, and I also wonder what kind of it's almost like a Freudian thing they're going for here, where even though she's playing Olivia, she looks and sounds like Edie Falco in this really kind of weird way. And I don't know if they were intentionally going somewhere with that. I could see them doing that, but yeah, they bring something here, but it still feels like there's a lot that could have gone. Vera Farmiga gets a lot more to work with than Bernthal does, obviously, because Bernthal goes away for a while, obviously, but. There's, yeah, the thing that was really drawing me in, though, when I was hearing about all these castings was, apart from Bernthal and the whole Gandolfini connection, Corey Stoll as Junior, I don't think could have been more perfect. Like, this is, like, he's here just enough. Like, it doesn't feel like he's in it too much, and it doesn't feel like he's underused. And this is, as soon as I heard that he was cast as Junior, I felt like, well, that's perfect. And then seeing this performance, this is exactly what I wanted out of this. And so I don't know that Corey Stoll is incapable of a bad performance, and this one in particular, where it's like, and it didn't necessarily just feel like because a lot of these characters that already existed that we're just seeing younger versions of, it would have been really easy for the actors to sort of fall into imitation. And with Corso, I feel like we literally took a time machine and Saul Jr. A little bit younger. As far as imitation, I don't know how other people feel about this, and I get, you know, that the character already is the character the way he is, but Silvio Silvio here feels like parody. Like it kind of felt like we were watching like a Sopranos prequel, and then whenever Silvio would come in, it felt like a Sopranos spoof a little bit. Like it was yeah. I don't know if that worked for me or not, but we also have Billy Magnuson in here as Paulie, and that's another one where like I saw a still of him and I was like, all right, yeah, I can kind of see that now. But that's the thing is when you're introducing a lot of new characters, but you also have all these characters that we know. There's going to be people that kind of get cut down, and so Paulie's like basically in the background for most scenes. He gets like one scene where he gets to get pissed about his new suit getting damaged. But apart from that, a lot of these people are just kind of in the background, and we introduce a lot of new people. Joey Diaz fits into this world much more. Like it was one of those cases where when I learned he was in it, I had to stop and think, was he in the show? Because it seems like it definitely seems like a world he would have already been in. And Nick Vallelonga is in this as well, just kind of hanging around, which is really nice because of Tony Lip having a small part in the show. It kind of feels like it's come full circle. But obviously, the thing that's getting a lot of attention, because you'll notice that I haven't really gone much into the whole Dickie thing, and that's because it is. Feels like, despite this being the Dickie story, a lot of it is just like the infighting in his family is what a lot of it is. Because we've got the whole thing with his dad's wife, who eventually becomes his mistress, she eventually goes off with somebody else. She's got this whole square thing that's not even a triangle at this point. And that's a whole thing that's just really not that interesting. And then we introduce the other Leota character, and while it does seem ridiculous that Leota's playing two different characters, it's one of those cases where he's playing twins, so it's like you have that thought in the back of your head of like, did they run out of money? Like, did they run out of people to cast? As ridiculous as it sounds, Leota does effectively play two completely different characters. Like there's Dickie's father, who's very, very boisterous and loud, and one of the like we usually get either one or the other of Ray Liotta. There's the really over the top one, and then there's the one that's like really like a lot colder and calmer. And he gets to do both of those. Like one brother is each of those personalities. He breaks that up surprisingly well, even as ridiculous as that might sound. And that's another, like, the other Leota is where, another case where Dickie's dealing with stuff. And then we've got Leslie Odom Jr.'s character coming in here, who's becoming a threat throughout. But this is stuff that just kind of doesn't really go anywhere or have much to it. There's, like, not much meat to any of this. Because the whole first hour is this thing involving the riots in that era, and there's... That kind of felt like something different in itself, like something that wasn't even a part of this story. And there's a whole lot going on. There's a lot of disconnected things going on all at once. So you can see where the main interest for a lot of people in this movie was Michael Gandolfini taking over his dad's role of Tony. And we get Tony for the first half as like a child, and then in the second half it's the teenage Tony. And yeah, that is one of the more interesting aspects of the movie, clearly. Even though it is almost halfway in when we finally get to that point. And he does have moments. There's one particular moment when there's this very haunting moment where we see Christopher as a baby. And when this baby Christopher is around Tony, he, like, cries. And that in itself is like this sort of haunting thing, like we know what's going to happen, but then they end up laying it on too thick, and they have one of the other characters say, like, babies know what's going to happen from beyond, or something like that. And it's like it was haunting enough to just kind of have the baby cry around Tony. That made the point. But yeah, and obviously there's going to be a lot of callbacks. Obviously we get the varsity athlete line and stuff like that, which does just feel like fan service. But like I said, there is other stuff that might be more subtle that may have gone by me. But some of the stuff felt a bit just like the fan service and the lines that people were already quoting anyway. Um, but as far as the way Gandolfini handles this, what's great about this is not only does he sort of have like the expressions and the way he moves and talks. There's one scene in particular where he gets antagonized, and this is the case where it's like through the whole movie he's just like the kid that idolizes Dickie, and like but he's actually a much smaller part in Dickie's life than he would probably like to be. So we're kind of seeing him strive for that. But then there's one moment where we can kind of see a bit of a turning point where there is like an innocence to Tony throughout it. Um, and even the stuff that he does that could be considered, reckless or rule breaking, it's just very light and done in this very sort of almost like fun tone, which works for that as he's just sort of rising to the idea of this life. But then there's a later moment when he gets antagonized by somebody, and he just kind of turns and looks at them, and it is incredibly intimidating, and you can really see the future Tony in him right there. And that's the thing is, that's kind of when the movie started to find its footing. But the trouble is, it's like the last half hour. Like, like all this stuff going on, the movie seems to finally find the right, road to go down. But it's in like the last half hour where we start to feel that way. And I do think, I know a lot of people were saying, because this was so condensed into just 2 hours, that it could have been another series or at least a mini series. And I'm always hesitant to say something should be a, because there's a lot of cases where something seems like it might have a lot of meat, but then it ends up not having enough meat to sustain a series. But if we had just gotten something like Irishman length, I would have been really interested in that. And like kind of in the tone of the Irishman would have been really cool also. Where you could have had something that was, felt epic, but also felt like right in line with the classics of this genre. Like this just kind of feels like any other, generic gangster movie, which really should not be the case when we're dealing with like something that's really, like it almost feels like an understatement to say it's a staple in the gangster genre. It's the fucking Sopranos. It's like, I mean, outside of like Scorsese's movies, that's it. Like it's Scorsese's movies, and it's that. That's the gold standard of this whole thing. And to have something like this have the vibe of like something like The Irishman and have that expansive quality without having to be a series, I think could have worked. Like just adding another hour and a half to this and just making an epic movie could have been something really special and could have given it the room. But I still think there's stuff like I said, the stepmom turned girlfriend thing is something that probably could have been significantly cut down. But and just more in like the business itself is where we could have been. Like this Leslie Odom story needed a lot more, and could have been really interesting. And it could have been interesting to have him be like a sort of antagonist amongst these bad people anyway. But it just kind of doesn't really. I mean, it ultimately just becomes unresolved, which I guess you could write off and say it's like that's sometimes what happens. Where it's like when you get to the finale of the series, there was a lot, or even each season kind of had moments where we kind of wrapped something up and a character eventually got off for one reason or another, and it felt like some sort of closure to each thing. And then when we got to the end of the series itself, there were those closures where people got off, but then there was also cases where some things did just kind of go unresolved, like characters just kind of continue on, and there's not really any sort of closure to them, and it's like I can see that vibe with the Odom character, where it's just like this is where he is now, and that's just where it's gonna be now. We're just gonna go from there, but I don't know. It still leaves a little something, but I do wonder what the movie would have looked like if instead of taking that approach of Tony's just kind of a small part of Dickie's life as much as he idolizes him, if we kind of gotten it split down the middle and it was like half a Dickie movie and half a Tony movie, and how those things collided, um, I think that's more of what people might have been expecting, and I think it probably would have made a more interesting movie. But it's yeah, I can see what they were going for. I think if I'm if I'm looking at it correctly, but I don't know. It feels like there was a lot here, but at the same time, while it does have all these problems and it does have a lot going on, I've noticed that I've been like thinking about it ever since I watched it. Which, when you know are watching movies in quick succession and just kind of going on to the next, doesn't typically happen. So it always makes me wonder about a movie whenever I actually like can't stop thinking about it even after I've gone on to other movies since. So I am interested in revisiting it and maybe seeing if there's richer things in here that maybe just went by me the first time. Or if, it'll feel like it comes together. If it's a little more cohesive than it looks. Or if the sort of uncohesive nature is what's gonna, add to its quality. But right now I'm just kind of in the middle. There's things I really like about it that I would have liked to have seen expanded, but there's a lot of stuff that really doesn't need to be here. So that's pretty much how I feel about it. Just a whole bunch of like mixed feelings, I guess, which to my understanding was pretty much the consensus. So yeah. So let's finish with The Guilty, Jake Gyllenhaal's new movie with Antoine Fuqua, which is a remake of a movie from 2018, which it wasn't nominated in the foreign category at the Oscars, but it was in contention to be nominated, and that's when I saw it. And from what I remember, this is very, very close. Obviously, there's a change in location where we're in Los Angeles now, and they've got the fires going on. So there is this sort of like tension that feels like it's mounting outside, even though the story is set in this one building, and more often than not in one room. And we just have Gyllenhaal here. To my understanding, the whole thing was Gyllenhaal's idea, where they were in, lockdown and all that, and it was like, we could, shoot this really quickly. And I think it was 11 days they ended up shooting it. He and Antoine Fuqua, who obviously already know each other from Southpaw. And, yeah, the story is quite simple. It is just it's a cop that's been demoted to a 911 operator, and then he's taking these calls and just trying to... We get the sense that something is wrong, and they really kind of build up what exactly it was that got him demoted, and that's clearly something that's like festering inside him and boiling inside him as he takes these calls, and then ultimately, obviously, he's going to get a major call that takes us through the duration of the movie. It's a great setup, especially for kind of doing like the one-man show kind of thing and just having voice actors come in and out. All the voice actors in this, or most of them, will be, recognizable voices, which I honestly thought would be distracting, but not too much. Like, Ethan Hawke's voice is very noticeable, Peter Sarsgaard's voice. Riley Hewitt has a really great performance here also as far as voice work goes. Bill Burr jumps in here for like 10 seconds, really obviously. And that's a case where it's good that it was as short as it was, because that might have been distracting. When they're that recognizable, it might have been distracting. Paul Dano was in here, and I didn't even recognize his voice until the credits. So that ended up working out well. So that might seem like a problem at the service, but that's not. It's really the case of, I guess, how you take Gyllenhaal's performance, because that's the movie. And I can see people who have seen the original maybe not taking to this as much, because the original is so incredibly downplayed, and to the point that like, obviously Gyllenhaal is one of those actors where he can do, subtle and quiet, but Gyllenhaal also can very much play to the back of the room just as much, and I think there could have been more of a balance of that here. It does feel a lot more like the performance is the playing at the back of the room kind. When we could have had a bit more of the subtle work here, but at the same time, this is a character that was already at the end of his rope at the start of this story, and obviously this is just going to build and build. Like, to the point that I do remember, this is so similar to the original. Like, I was having memories of the original that I had forgotten about. But there's like a moment when he's just turns to the guy next to him and he says, hey, I know I've been an asshole lately, and I'm sorry about that. And I did remember a moment in the original where he says that to the person next to, and I remember thinking, like, he didn't seem all that asshole-ish to me, but, I mean, it's to kind of show you just how bigger the performance is going to be from Gyllenhaal, and how maybe not as subtle everything's going to be here. Um, but a lot of people might immediately dismiss that as this one is lesser because of that. But it's really just two completely different performances, is all it is. And they add another element to... I don't remember, like, the family element in the original movie. So there's a whole other thing going on here where Gyllenhaal's, like, trying to get in contact with his daughter before she goes to bed and stuff like that. And that's obviously going to raise the tension with him as well. And then the sort of... how that's a constant thing in the back of his head when he's dealing with this call, which involves, children, and specifically a little girl, and that's going to get him more invested in it. And motivate him more into how into this he ends up getting into. And that's probably a bit on the nose, but I feel like it works well enough. There is that whole feeling of, like, it's about him basically attempting to atone for whatever this is that he got demoted for, and the fact that that recklessness in that situation is what got him here, and we see that recklessness coming through when he's in this situation now also. So I can see where it's this whole thing of the performance is kind of constantly heightened. I was also getting vibes of... there was a movie last year or a couple years ago with Joseph Gordon-Levitt that was mostly him. It was the hijacking movie. That's name I can't I can't remember off the top of my head. I was getting vibes of that also in regards to this kind of being a similar performance and the way the tension heightens throughout it, and the more the actor has to commit in this particular case a big way, unlike the original. There were cases when you talk about the commitment, if you want to talk about like what Fuqua was doing here, as far as the visual of it. There was one moment where I was afraid they were going to cop out, because obviously the whole thing here is that it's all in one room and like one confined space, and we don't see outside of it. There was one moment when a car gets pulled over, and we see, like, it kind of dissolves, and we kind of see the image of a cop pulling somebody over. And it was... well, it didn't quite cop out, like it almost did, but it's that case of... I guess they were trying to show, like, what it probably looked like in his mind, or like the whole thing of... This may not be exactly what's happening, but it's his vague vision as he's listening to it in his mind. I guess. They only did that like once, so I'm not even sure why it's here to begin with, but I was afraid at first we were just going to see the whole scene play out, but luckily it's not that, so yeah. It finds ways in like the very end to maybe cop out a little bit, but that's stuff we won't go into. Another thing that I thought was handled well here, it does make you wonder where the quality of a movie is when the stuff that you like is the fact that they didn't make bad decisions. Like how you can imagine the movie if it was made by a worse filmmaker, and it's like you're just glad the movie's not that. So like with how frantic this is, and how frantic the performance is, and how frantic the situation is, I can imagine a worse movie where this is really heavily edited a lot. Like there's a lot of cutting back and forth and a lot of close-ups and shit like that. I'm really glad that it's not that. There's actually quite a bit where the camera will just linger on Gyllenhaal for long periods of time. And so being able to just sort of take in the concept like that and let the performance do its thing by itself and build the tension that way and naturally, like we're in the room with him, is a much more effective way to do that. So we do eventually get to the end where it does get... I'm pretty sure there are like a couple of changes here from the original. Once again, the original did kind of take a more not as in-your-face approach in a way to just kind of let it sort of linger with you. And obviously, this one's going to be a bit more straightforward. And like I said, in some cases I don't really mind that, but in other cases it can be a bit like it doesn't trust the audience enough. And that can be unfortunate because there are audiences, like, there are people that just turn on movies and then just stare at their phones and shit, that you have to spell everything out for. And but when a movie comes along that doesn't cater to that, is where you can find something potentially special. But this is one of those ones where it's like they do kind of have to. They say and do a little more than they probably have to get their point across, when less would have maybe been a bit more. And it's interesting to look at a movie like this that is so bare bones and say that they're still maybe doing a little more than they could have or should have. But obviously the thing that's going to pull people in is this Gyllenhaal performance, and if they're not familiar with the story, I can see this being, like, really, really good and successful for Netflix, and something that people, recommend, especially since it's so short and there's not much to it, and it's involving pretty quickly. So yeah, so it's yeah. I wonder how I would feel. I would probably feel stronger about it if I didn't have the original kind of in the back of my head vaguely, but it's yeah. It's fine for what it is, and has, some powerful moments in it that come from Gyllenhaal's performance, but that's basically all it really is. So yeah. So I guess we're just gonna end this at this, and we'll go on to next week, which is Bond finally. And I think we'll probably talk about the Addams Family as well, and maybe one other thing, and then we've got, horror verses and more Tremor stuff and all that other stuff that we've been talking about is coming. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.